Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving deep into something I find really fascinating, and that's human judgment and decision-making. And we're using selections that you, the listener, have provided from Thinking Fast and Slow. It's by Daniel Kahneman, and this book has so many crazy ideas in it.
It's completely changed the game, really, the way we understand our own minds.
Yeah. And right away, Kahneman talks about how we have these two systems of thinking that we use, System 1 and System 2, that are constantly fighting with each other in our heads.
That's right. Yeah, you can think about it like system one is that, like a quick gut reaction system. It's fast, it's automatic, and really relies on your intuition, your emotions. Think about it like if you're catching a ball that someone throws to you. You don't have time to overthink it. System one just kind of takes over.
That's like our autopilot, right?
Yeah.
And we have this System 2, which is much more thoughtful, analytical.
Exactly. Yeah. System two is slower, much more deliberate, and it really steps in when you need to solve a complex problem or you need to make a careful decision. That's kind of the voice of reason, but it takes a lot more effort.
Okay. So what are we trying to figure out with this deep dive? What are we hoping to learn?
We're going to explore how these two systems kind of work together to make our judgments and decisions. And here's the thing, how that can lead us to make predictable errors and have biases.
So we're going to figure out why us humans sometimes make, let's just say, not the best choices. But the good news is, if we can understand these biases, we can learn how to make better decisions.
Right, exactly. Yes, and that's the best part about Kahneman's work. It's not just about understanding our flaws, but about using that knowledge to make more informed decisions in the future.
All right, I'm ready to have my mind blown, so where should we start?
Well, let's start with intuition. Think about those times where you just knew the right answer, but you didn't really know why. That's intuition at work. And Herbert Simon, he was a pioneer in artificial intelligence. He thought of intuition as recognition built up from so much experience over time.
It's like that example in the book about the chess master who can just look at the board and immediately know the best move. That's always blown my mind.
It's amazing, right? But here's the thing. Intuition isn't perfect. It can lead us in the wrong direction, and this is where those predictable errors start to kind of sneak in. One example that Kahneman highlights is called the halo effect. Have you ever noticed how your first impression of someone, whether it's good or bad, it just colors your perception of them, even if you find out new information that completely contradicts that first impression?
Yeah, I see that all the time. It's like if you meet someone who's incredibly charming and you automatically assume they're also intelligent, that they're trustworthy.
Exactly. That's the halo effect in action. And it's not always about positive traits either. Like if you get a negative first impression of someone, that can stick with you too. And you might be more likely to see their flaws, even when they might not really be there.
It's funny. That actually reminds me of the part in the book where Kahneman thought that more politicians had affairs than, like, doctors or lawyers. And he realized later that he probably only thought that because the media covers politician scandals so much.
Exactly. That's a perfect example of what we call the availability heuristic. It means we tend to judge how likely something is based on how easily we can think of an example. And media coverage can really affect that. Think about it. Like, if you hear about shark attacks on the news a lot, you might think the risk of getting bitten is higher than it actually is, even though statistically it's so rare.
It's crazy how easily our minds can be swayed by what's just sitting there in our memories. It's almost like System 1 is always searching for patterns and jumping to conclusions, even if those conclusions aren't really accurate.
That's a great way to think about it. Kahneman calls System 1 a mental shotgun. So it's not like this really precise or targeted process, but it's just this blast of information processing that's happening all the time, often even without us realizing it.
So it's like System 1 is giving us all these possible interpretations, and our brain just picks whichever one seems to make the most sense at that moment.
Exactly. And one way it does that is through what Kahneman calls judgment heuristics. They're basically mental shortcuts that let us make quick decisions.
Like when we judge someone's competence just based on their facial features. I remember Kahneman talking about how we look at someone's face and assess how strong they are or how trustworthy they are.
Yes. And even though those snap judgments might feel really intuitive, they can also be really misleading. Our brains are just wired to look for patterns, make those quick assessments, even if there's no real evidence to prove them.
This reminds me of that invisible gorilla experiment, where people are so focused on counting basketball passes that they totally miss someone in a gorilla suit just walking right through the scene.
Ah, yes. A classic example of cognitive ease. When things feel easy for our minds, we tend to believe them more. And because of that, we might actually miss important details that don't fit the story we've created in our heads.
Oh, right. And that reminds me of another experiment. Kahneman describes one where if you just repeat a person's name a few times, it can make them seem more famous and believable.
You got it. Repetition breeds familiarity, and familiarity breeds believability. Think about advertising slogans, or even political propaganda. The more we hear something repeated, the more we accept it as true, even if there's nothing behind it.
That's a little scary, isn't it? Makes you realize how vulnerable we are to all these little influences that we might not even be aware of.
It is, and that's why it's so important to understand these biases. Once we know how our minds can be tricked, then we can be more critical of the information we're taking in.
Okay, so we've seen how our intuition can be really powerful, but also a liability. So how do we find a balance? How do we, get the speed and efficiency of System 1 without falling for those traps?
That is the question. And Kahneman gives some valuable insights into that. One of his most important concepts is what he calls WYSIOD. It stands for what you see is all there is.
WYSIOD. Okay, I'm going to write that one down. So what does it mean?
It describes how System 1 tends to create these really coherent stories based on the little information it has, even if it's ignoring crucial data that's missing.
So it's like our brains are these expert storytellers always trying to make sense of the world, even if we're missing some of the pieces of the puzzle.
Exactly. The problem is that those stories can feel so real and complete that we forget how much we actually don't know.
Kind of like building a house of cards. It might look impressive, but without a strong foundation, it'll totally collapse. I remember, to illustrate this, Kahneman uses that example of Tom W. Do you remember that?
Of course. It's a classic example of WYSIOD. So people are given a description of Tom W., who's a grad student, and they're asked to rank how likely he is to be enrolled in different areas of study. What's really interesting is that people often ignore the base rates, meaning the actual probabilities of those majors, and instead they just look at how well Tom W.'s description matches stereotypes they have.
Oh, right. So even if, statistically, there are a ton more computer science students than, let's say, humanities students, they might still rank Tom W. as more likely to be a humanities student just because the way he's described matches their idea of what a humanities student is like.
Yes, exactly. It shows how much we rely on representativeness. It's a key heuristic of System 1, and because of that, we might ignore really important statistical information.
How do we not fall into this trap? I'm starting to get a little paranoid about my own judgment here.
Don't worry, being aware is the first step. When you understand WISID, we can start to train ourselves to consider both the base rates, those statistical probabilities, and the individual information. It's all about balancing intuitive judgment with a more data-driven approach.
That's great advice. It's like we need to think more like statisticians and less like storytellers, at least sometimes. All right, so what's the next mind-blowing bias we should be watching out for?
Well, this one is especially important in our world of negotiating and sales. It's called anchoring.
Anchoring. Okay, tell me more.
All right, imagine this. You spin a wheel of fortune and it's rigged to either land on 10 or 65. Pretty random, right?
Totally random. What's the point?
Well, after they spun the wheel, they asked people to estimate the percentage of African nations in the United Nations.
On what happened?
Those who spun a 10 guessed a much lower percentage than those who spun a 65, even though the wheel spin was totally arbitrary. That random number actually acted as what we call an anchor, and it influenced their estimations without them even realizing it.
Wow, that's wild.
I know, right? It shows how powerful irrelevant numbers can be on our judgments.
That probably happens all the time in the real world.
All the time. Think about things like negotiating a salary or buying a house. That first offer, even if it's ridiculous, can act as an anchor and change how you see what's actually reasonable.
This is crazy. So how can we avoid being influenced by these anchoring effects?
Well, you just have to be aware of them. When you're negotiating, don't let the first offer, no matter how crazy, control your thinking. Do your research, know what you're worth, and be ready to walk away if the deal isn't good.
Yeah, that's great advice.
Huh.
And speaking of research, did Kahneman do all his work in, a lab?
Actually, he and his research partner, Amos Tversky, they spent a really productive year at the Oregon Research Institute in Eugene. They were guests and ended up doing a ton of experiments. A lot of them were on anchoring and other biases.
Interesting. Okay, so we've talked about the two systems of thinking, the halo effect, the availability heuristic, WIITE, and now anchoring. It's like we're learning how our minds really work. What's next?
Well, anyone who has ever had a hard time meeting a deadline will definitely understand this next one. It's called the planning fallacy.
The planning fallacy, you mean like that magical thinking where we convince ourselves that we could totally finish that huge project in, like, way less time than is actually possible?
That's the one. It's when we overestimate our abilities and underestimate how long things will actually take, especially when it comes to complex
I
things.
remember Kahneman shares a story about this in the book, and it's kind of funny but also painful. Didn't he think it would take him, like, way less time to write a textbook than it actually did?
He did. He initially thought it would take him about 2 years, but it took 8.
8 years. Wow. I'm starting to think I have a serious case of the planning fallacy. How do we beat this optimistic bias?
Kahneman says we should try taking an outside view. Instead of focusing on our own plans and what we think will happen, we should look at similar projects and how long they actually took to finish. Learn from other people's experiences and just be realistic about potential setbacks and problems.
So basically, we have to stop thinking we're superhuman and be more realistic, like getting a second opinion from someone who's been there before.
Exactly. It's about being more objective and admitting that things don't always go exactly as planned. Now, you're ready to dive into a bias that really affects how we see value and make financial decisions.
Hit me with it. This is getting really good.
This one is called loss aversion. It's the idea that, to us, the pain of losing something feels stronger than the pleasure of gaining something of the same value.
Oh, loss aversion. I guess that explains why it's so hard to sell something for less than we paid for it, even if it's just sitting in our closet collecting dust.
You got it. Loss aversion causes all sorts of interesting biases, like the endowment effect, where we think things are worth more just because we own them, and the status quo bias, where we don't want to change things even when it's good for us.
Right, Kahneman talks about that experiment with the coffee mugs, right?
Yes. They gave people coffee mugs randomly, and those who got one suddenly wanted twice as much money to sell it as those who didn't have one were willing to pay to buy it.
It's like just by having something, we automatically think it's more valuable.
Exactly. And this has a huge impact on everything from investing to negotiating to just cleaning out our home.
Okay, so loss aversion is definitely a bias to watch out for. What else do we have? This is great.
Well, how about framing effects? It's all about how the way a choice is presented to us can totally change our decisions, even if the options are basically the same logically.
Right, I remember Kahneman using the example of the disease outbreak. It's amazing how framing can really sway our judgment.
Yeah, it's a classic example. He gives two options for fighting a deadly disease, both with the exact same statistical outcomes. But when he frames the options in terms of lives saved versus lives lost, people pick differently even though the results are the same.
So it's not just about the facts, but how those facts are presented to us. It's like our brains are wired to be swayed by the story, how it's framed, even if the logic is the same.
That's it. And that's why it's important to know about framing effects. When you're making a decision, try to reframe the problem in a few different ways and see if your preferences change. Are you being influenced by the way the information is presented, or is your choice based on understanding the facts?
Okay, that's a really good tip. It's like we need to be more aware of the language and presentation being used to influence us. Okay, what other mind-blowing insights does Kahneman have? We're on a roll here.
Well, let's change gears a little bit and talk about how Kahneman sees happiness. He makes this interesting distinction between something he calls the experiencing self and the remembering self.
Okay, I'm interested. Tell me about these two selves.
Well, the experiencing self is the one that's living in the moment, feeling all the sensations of pleasure or pain. Then there's the remembering self. That's the one that kind of judges the past and forms memories about our happiness overall.
So the experiencing self is all about right now, and the remembering self is the one looking back and making up the story of our lives.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that they don't always agree. Sometimes we make decisions that make the remembering self happy, even if it means sacrificing how much we actually enjoy something in the moment.
That seems a little backward. Why would we want to remember something as good if it wasn't actually that fun to experience?
It all goes back to that peak end rule we talked about earlier. Our memories are really influenced by the most intense part of an experience and how it ends, even if those moments weren't typical of the whole thing.
So it's like we're making our own highlight reels, focusing on the best parts and the endings, even if the other parts weren't that great.
Exactly. And this has a big impact on how we plan vacations, evaluate our careers, everything.
Okay, I could see how this fits into the bigger picture, but honestly, after learning about all these cognitive biases, it makes you wonder, are we really just controlled by these things that we don't even know about, like puppets on strings?
It can feel that way, right? But that's where the power of Kahneman's work comes in. He's not just showing us our limitations, but he's giving us the power to overcome them.
So are you saying that if we understand these biases, we can actually change our behavior? Is it really that simple?
Well, it's not always easy, but it's possible. Kahneman says we can debias ourselves, at least a little, by becoming aware of those mental traps we tend to fall into.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we teach our brains to think more clearly and make decisions that are more rational?
The first step is just being aware. The more we know about the common biases that affect us, the better we can see them happening.
It's like learning a new language. Once you know the words, you can understand the conversations going on around you.
Exactly. And the more we practice recognizing these biases, the more likely we are to catch ourselves before falling into the same old mental traps.
That makes sense. But let's be real. Changing how we think isn't easy. Are there any tips we can use to really fight these biases?
There are. For example, let's say you're about to make a big decision, like buying a car or taking a new job. One good strategy is to force yourself to see things from different points of view. Think about the bad things that could happen, the risks you might be ignoring.
So like, be your own devil's advocate.
Exactly. Challenge your own assumptions and see if your opinion changes. You can also try looking at the problem from different angles, reframing it to make sure you're not being tricked by how the information is presented.
It's like we need to be more skeptical of our own thinking. Question those first gut reactions that might come from bias and not logic.
That's a great way to put it. It's about using System 2, the more thoughtful side of our brain, to balance out the quick judgments from System 1.
I like that. But is there ever a time when we should just trust our gut feeling, even if it could be biased?
Absolutely. Intuition can be really useful, especially in situations where we have a lot of experience. Think about a firefighter who instantly knows a situation is dangerous, or a doctor who can diagnose a patient quickly based on years of knowledge.
So it's not about always ignoring our intuition, but knowing when to trust it and when to stop and think things through more carefully.
Exactly. It's about finding the right balance. And to do that, we need to understand how our minds work, know our strengths, weaknesses, and those tricky biases that can trip us up.
This has been such a fascinating conversation. But I have to say, learning about all these cognitive biases makes me a little worried. It shows how easily we can be tricked by our own minds.
I understand how you feel, but remember, knowledge is power. The more we know about these biases, the better we can make decisions.
I guess you're right. It's like being given a map to a dangerous place. We might still run into trouble, but at least we know what to watch out for.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, even the best navigators can get lost sometimes. The key is to keep learning, keep practicing, and try to make better choices.
Wow. This has been an eye-opening deep dive. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of myself and how people think.
That's great to hear. You know, it makes me think about one of the most interesting parts of Kahneman's work, and that's something he calls the focusing illusion.
The focusing illusion. What's that?
It's the idea that whatever we're paying attention to at this moment will seem more important than it really is. Like, when you're hungry, food is the most important thing in the world. But once you eat, it doesn't seem as important anymore.
Yeah, I get that. But how does this connect to decision-making?
Well, it shows how easily our sense of what's important can be messed up by what we happen to be focused on at that moment. Kahneman talks about a study where he compared the happiness of students in California and the Midwest.
I'm guessing the Californians were happier with all that sunshine and the beaches.
That's what most people think. Even Kahneman thought that. But guess what? There is actually no difference in their overall happiness.
Really? So
Yeah.
even though we might think things like climate or how much money we have are super important for happiness, it's actually more complicated than that.
Exactly. The focusing illusion tricks us into thinking that whatever's front and center is more important than it really is.
So what does that mean for making decisions?
It means we need to be really careful about what we're focused on and how that might be changing our view of things. Are we giving too much importance to certain things and overlooking others that might be just as important or even more important?
It's a good reminder that how we see things is always affected by our current situation and what's grabbing our attention. We need to step back and see the bigger picture.
That's it. It takes practice to do that. But the more we understand the focusing illusion, the better we'll be at making decisions that are truly good for us.
This is all incredibly helpful. It's like we're getting a secret code to understand the human mind and see through those illusions that can lead us in the wrong direction.
I like that analogy. It really shows how freeing it can be to understand these cognitive biases. We're not just stuck with how our minds work. We can learn to be more aware and intentional in our choices.
Well, we've gone really deep into human judgment and decision-making, looking at all these cognitive biases and how our intuitive and thoughtful selves work together. But before we finish this deep dive, I have one last question.
I'd love to hear it. What's on your mind?
Well, we've talked a lot about how we can debias ourselves, how to see and fight those mental shortcuts that mess us up. But could there be a downside to being too rational, too analytical?
That's a great question, and it's something that Kahneman himself talks about in his book.
So, is it possible to be too rational?
It's about finding the right balance. While it's super important to know about our biases and use system 2 when making big decisions, there's also a problem with overthinking everything. Sometimes our gut feelings, our intuitions can be right, especially if we have a lot of experience in that area.
So it's like we need to find that perfect spot between blindly following our instincts and analyzing every single possibility forever.
Exactly. And to find that balance, we need to understand both our intuitive and our deliberate ways of thinking. What are they good at? What are their weaknesses?
It sounds like it's a journey of self-discovery that never really ends. What's so interesting to me is that even after all this research and all these studies, we're still just starting to figure out how our minds work.
You're right, and that's what makes this field so exciting. Every new discovery leads to even more questions. It's a constant exploration of the human mind.
I am definitely hooked. This deep dive has been amazing. I feel like I have a totally new view of how humans make decisions, and I'm excited to keep learning more about it.
Me too. There's so much more to explore in Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, and who knows what other fascinating biases and illusions are waiting to be discovered.
This is one deep dive I won't forget. Thanks for joining me on this incredible journey.
The pleasure was all mine. And remember, the next time you have to make a decision, big or small, just take a second to pause and think. Ask yourself, is my gut feeling tricking me? Am I focused on the right things? Even a little bit of deliberate thinking can make a big difference.
That's such great advice. We have these amazing minds, but it's our job to learn how to use them well. Thanks again for this awesome deep dive.
So as we were saying before, one of the most interesting parts of Kahneman's work is this idea of bounded rationality. It's how our decision-making isn't always as logical or objective as we might think.
Yeah, it's definitely humbling to realize that even really smart people can be swayed by these little cognitive biases.
Totally. It makes you wonder, like, how much control do we actually have over our own choices? Especially when you think about how our memories, what Kahneman calls our remembering selves, can affect our decisions.
You're right. We were just talking about the experiencing self versus the remembering self. Can you remind me how that all fits in?
Well, remember, the experiencing self is all about living in the moment, feeling those immediate sensations of pleasure or pain. But the remembering self, that's the one that kind of creates the story of our lives, focusing on the best parts and the endings, and often forgetting those everyday details.
And because of that peak end rule, where we tend to judge an experience based on its most intense moment and how it ends, we might make decisions that prioritize having a good story to tell later, rather than actually enjoying ourselves in the moment.
Exactly. Think about, like, how we choose vacations. We often pick places or activities that will give us those, Instagram-worthy moments, even if it means giving up some comfort or spontaneity. It's like we're more concerned with the memories we'll share than the actual experience we'll have.
Oh, I know I've done that for sure. Choosing a hotel that looks amazing in pictures over one that might be more relaxing or authentic, it's almost like we're trying to impress our future selves with how awesome our lives look.
Yeah. It's like we're making our own highlight reels. And it's not just vacations. This happens with careers, relationships, even how we spend our free time. Are we choosing things that make us happy right now, or are we choosing things that will look good in the story of our lives?
It really makes you think. And it shows how much power our remembering selves have over our decisions. But knowing all this about cognitive biases, it makes me wonder, are we really in control, or are we just puppets being controlled by these things we don't even know about?
It can feel that way sometimes, for sure. But I think that's the great thing about Kahneman's work. By showing us these biases, he's not just showing us our weaknesses, he's giving us a way to overcome them.
So are you saying that if we understand these biases, we can actually change our behavior? Is it that easy?
Well, it's not always easy, but it's definitely possible. Kahneman believes that we can debias ourselves, at least to a certain extent, by becoming more aware of those mental traps that we fall into.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? How do we retrain our brains to think more clearly and make decisions that are more rational?
It starts with awareness. The more we understand about those common biases, the better we are at spotting them when they happen.
It's like learning a new language. Once you know the words, you can understand the conversations happening around you.
Exactly. And the more we practice recognizing these biases, the better we'll get at catching ourselves before we fall into those same old traps.
That makes sense. But let's be honest, changing how we think is hard. Are there any practical things we can do to actually fight these biases?
Definitely. For example, imagine you're about to make a big decision, like buying a car or choosing a new job. One really effective strategy is to force yourself to consider other perspectives. Think about the potential downsides, the risks you might be overlooking.
So kind of like play devil's advocate with yourself.
Exactly. Challenge your own assumptions and see if your opinion changes. You can also try looking at the problem from different angles, reframing it to make sure you're not being swayed by how the information is presented.
It's like we need to become more skeptical of our own thinking. Question those first gut reactions that might be based on bias rather than logic.
That's a great way to put it. It's about using system 2, the more thoughtful side of our brains, to balance out those quick judgments from system 1.
I like that. But is there ever a time when it's okay to just trust our gut feeling, even if it might be influenced by bias?
For sure, intuition can be a really powerful tool, especially in situations where we have a lot of experience. Think about a firefighter who can just sense that a situation is dangerous, or a doctor who can quickly diagnose a patient based on years of knowledge.
So it's not about always ignoring our intuition, but knowing when to trust it and when to take a step back and use our analytical minds.
Exactly. It's all about finding the right balance. And the key is to really understand how our minds work, know our strengths, our weaknesses, and those sneaky biases that can trip us up.
This has been such an insightful conversation, but honestly, learning about all these cognitive biases is kind of fascinating and a little bit scary at the same time. It makes you realize how easily we can be tricked by our own minds.
I get it. I really do. But remember, knowledge is power. The more we know about these biases, the better decisions we can make.
I guess you're right. It's like having a map to a dangerous place. We might still run into some trouble, but at least we know what to watch out for.
Perfect analogy. And remember, even the best navigators can get lost sometimes. The most important thing is to keep learning, keep practicing, and keep trying to make better choices.
Wow, this has been an eye-opening deep dive. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of myself and how people think.
I'm so glad to hear that. And it
Yeah.
makes me think about one of the most thought-provoking parts of Kahneman's work, which is something he calls the focusing illusion.
The focusing illusion. What's that?
It's this idea that whatever we're paying attention to at any given moment will seem way more important than it really is. Like, when you're really hungry, food seems like the most important thing in the world, but as soon as you eat, it doesn't seem so important anymore.
Okay, yeah, I can relate to that. But how does this relate to making decisions?
Well, it shows how easily our sense of what's important can be distorted by what we happen to be focused on at that moment. Kahneman did a study where he compared the happiness of students in California and the Midwest.
I'm guessing the students in California were happier with all that sunshine and those beaches.
Yeah, that's what most people thought, including Kahneman. But here's the surprising thing. There was no difference in their overall happiness.
Really? So even though we might think that things like the weather or how much money we have are super important for happiness, it's not that simple.
Exactly. The focusing illusion tricks us into thinking that whatever's right in front of us is more important than it actually is.
So what does this mean for how we make decisions?
It means we need to be careful about what we're focusing on and how that might be affecting how we see things. Are we giving too much importance to certain things while ignoring other things that might be just as important or even more important?
It's a good reminder that our perspective is always changing based on our current situation and what's grabbing our attention. We need to step back and see the bigger picture.
You got it. And it's a skill that takes practice. The more we can train ourselves to recognize the focusing illusion, the better we'll be at making decisions that align with our real values and priorities.
This is all so helpful. It's like we're getting a secret decoder ring to understand how our minds work and see through those illusions that can lead us down the wrong path.
I love that analogy, and it shows how freeing it can be to understand these cognitive biases. We're not just stuck with how our minds work. We can become more aware and make better choices.
Okay, so we've explored a lot about human judgment and decision-making. We've uncovered all these cognitive biases and talked about the complex relationship between our intuitive and deliberate selves. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I have one final question that's been on my mind.
I'm all ears. What is it?
Well, we've spent a lot of time talking about how to debias ourselves, how to recognize and overcome those mental shortcuts that often lead us astray. But I can't help but wonder, is there a point where being too rational, too analytical could actually be a bad thing?
That is such an insightful question, and it's something that Kahneman himself brings up in his book.
So is there actually such a thing as being too rational?
It's really about finding the right balance. While it's super important to be aware of our biases and use System 2 in making big decisions, there's also a downside to overthinking everything. Sometimes our gut feelings or intuitions can actually be pretty accurate, especially if we have a lot of experience in that area.
So it's like we need to find that sweet spot between blindly following our instincts and endlessly analyzing every single possibility.
That's exactly it. And the key to finding that balance is understanding the strengths and weaknesses of both our intuitive and our more deliberate ways of thinking.
It sounds like a never-ending journey of self-discovery and improvement. But what I find so fascinating is that even after decades of research and countless studies, we're still only beginning to understand how our minds really work.
It's true. And that's what makes this field so captivating. Every new discovery opens up even more questions, urging us to keep exploring the mysteries of the human mind.
Well, I am definitely hooked. This deep dive has been such a rewarding experience. I feel like I've gained a whole new perspective on how humans make decisions, and I'm excited to continue learning more about it.
I feel the same way. There's so much more to uncover in Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. Who knows what other fascinating biases and illusions we might find along the way?
This is one deep dive I won't soon forget. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey.
The pleasure was all mine. And remember, the next time you face a decision, whether it's big or small, take a moment to pause and reflect. Ask yourself, is my gut feeling leading me astray? Am I focusing on the right things? Even a little bit of conscious thought can make a big difference.
That's a great reminder. We've been given these incredible minds, and it's our responsibility to learn how to use them effectively. Thanks again for this amazing deep dive. As we've been talking about all these cognitive biases and illusions, it's really striking how much of our lives is shaped by things we're not even aware of.
It is humbling, right? We think we're in control, but Kahneman's work shows just how much our System 1, our autopilot, is really running the show.
Makes you wonder if free will is just an illusion.
Yeah.
But really, I'm curious, what do you think about all this? Is it all bad news, or is there a good side to recognizing these quirks in our thinking?
You know, I'm actually pretty optimistic. For me, the good part is awareness. Once we see those patterns in how we think, how our minds can trick us, we're less likely to be controlled by them. We can actually start to nudge ourselves in a better direction.
So instead of just riding along on this mental roller coaster, we can take more control and steer a bit.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And I think that's the most important thing about Kahneman's work. He doesn't just point out our flaws, he shows us how to be more self-aware and make better choices.
That's what I find so empowering about all this. It's not just about understanding our minds. It's about using that knowledge to live better, more fulfilling lives. And that brings us back to that idea of the experiencing self and the remembering self. How can we use what we've learned to make choices that we enjoy in the moment, and then day and D create good memories for later?
That's the big question, isn't it? How do we find that balance? Kahneman doesn't give us easy answers, but he does give us a lot to think about. Like, remember the peak end rule. Maybe we should be more deliberate about creating those peak moments and good endings.
So instead of just letting things happen, we could actually try to shape our experiences to be more memorable. That's a pretty cool idea.
Yeah.
Almost like we're designing our lives to create the best memories possible.
Exactly. Think about it. When you're planning a vacation, you might focus on those experiences that will create really vivid, memorable peaks and satisfying endings, even if it means giving up a little bit of comfort or routine.
Okay, that makes sense for a vacation, but how would that work in everyday life?
It applies to all sorts of things. Work projects, relationships, hobbies, even just how we spend a Saturday afternoon. What are the moments that we'll really remember? How can we make the end of an experience, whether it's a workday or a weekend trip, something we'll look back on and feel good about?
So it's about being more intentional, thinking about the memories we're making, and choosing experiences that create a richer, more satisfying story for our lives.
Yes. And I think that's a really beautiful way to think about it, shaping the story of our lives. Because at the end of the day, happiness isn't just about feeling good right now, it's also about creating a sense of meaning and fulfillment that lasts.
That's such a powerful idea. It's like we're shifting our focus from those fleeting moments of happiness to a more lasting sense of well-being. And it makes me realize that understanding these biases and illusions isn't about becoming some kind of hyper-rational robot. It's about being self-aware enough to make choices that really matter to us.
You got it. It's about using what we know about our minds to live more authentically and create a life that reflects our values, both in the moment and in the stories we tell ourselves about our past.
This has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like I'm walking away with not just knowledge, but a whole new way of looking at life.
That's so great to hear, and I hope you'll keep exploring these ideas. Thinking Fast and Slow is a book you can come back to again and again, and every time you'll find something new.
I definitely will. Even this short exploration has given me so much to think about.
And remember, it's a journey, not a destination. There's always more to learn, more to discover about these amazing minds of ours.
Well, thank you for being such a great guide on this journey. I feel truly enlightened.
It was my pleasure. And remember, the next time you're making a decision, no matter how big or small, take a second to stop and think. Ask yourself, is my gut leading me astray? Am I focusing on the right things? Even a little bit of conscious thought can change everything.
That's a great reminder. We have these incredible minds, and it's up to us to learn how to use them well. Thanks again for this amazing deep dive.